Before we talk about Dot1x port-based authentication for a few minutes, just one more thing about port security, and I know you've had enough, but just one more thing. We saw that you can't put it on a port that is a trunk or has a chance of becoming a trunk. I just want to mention that goes for ports inside your Ether channels as well. And you also can't put port security on a span destination port. And if you don't know what a span destination port is, we're going to take care of that shortly. And I'll try to remind you of the port security issue with those ports when we're configuring them. Right now, we're going to stick with Dot1x port-based authentication. We're not going into nearly the detail with this that we did with port security. It involves extra hardware. The configurations can be a lot more complex. And the switch exam only goes so deep on it, their materials. So what we're going to do here is take an overview of it. A few commands you should know for the exam, that kind of thing, enough to get you started. And let's just go ahead and jump in right there, because why do we do this? Well, what we're doing is taking port level security to the next level. I know it's a cliche. With Dot1x port-based authentication. And the name refers simply to IEEE 802.1x, and that's the standard upon which the feature is based. I do mention it's a little unusual here that the Cisco authentication server involved has to be radius based. You can't use TACACS and you can't use TACACS Plus. Now, a major difference between this feature and port security is that both the host and the switch port have to be configured for 802.1x EPOL, the Extensible Authentication Protocol over LANs. Now, that's a huge departure for us because, frankly, most of the time with switching features, the host doesn't know what's going on, and we don't really want the host to be involved in it. It's just one more thing for us to do. But we have to have that with Dot1x port-based authentication. Now, the Radius version you're going to use, you may see it expressed two different ways. You may see it actually called Radius with EAP extensions. That's the Extensible Authentication Protocol, of course, or just called Radius. So one or the other here, but you really need Radius with the EAP extensions. Now, here's what a typical deployment is going to look like, and there's a little extra hardware involved in this one. We have the Dot1x enabled PC, the supplicant, the Dot1x enabled switch, which is the authenticator, and then an external server, a Radius server called the Authentication server. And that's our Radius with the AP extensions device. Now, I hate to insult you by even saying this, but we know the PC has a single physical port and you connect it to the switch with a cable. Okay, if we didn't know that, we wouldn't be here. But with Dot1x, that physical port is divided logically, naturally, into two ports by Dot1x. We have a controlled port and we have an uncontrolled port, which sounds awfully dangerous. We'll talk more about that in a second. But unlike typical sub-interfaces on routers that you and I have seen and or configured, the network admins, we don't have to do anything to configure these logical ports. Dot1x handles that. We just need to configure the supplicant for Dot1x. Strange but true, if the switch is ready for Dot1x authentication and the supplicant isn't, communications between the two fail. And you may say, well, that doesn't sound strange to me. It sounds right. That's not the strange part. If the supplicant is running Dot1x but the switch port isn't demanding that, the PC doesn't even concern itself with Dot1x. It just ignores it and will then communicate with the switch as it normally would. Strange but true. Now, about these controlled and uncontrolled ports, the controlled port can't transmit data until authentication actually takes place. Now, the uncontrolled port has a pretty good deal. That's why we call it uncontrolled, because it can transmit prior to authentication, but on a limited basis. Not enough to do any damage, right? The only things it can transmit are EAPOL, STP, and CDP. That's it. And by default, as we would expect, once the user authenticates, all traffic can be received and sent via that port. Let's go ahead and call the rack up here. And we're going to look at a few commands. Let me shorten this up for myself a little bit here. First things first, with anything related to AAA in any way, shape, or form, you've got to enable AAA with the command AAA new model. Do not take this exam without knowing that. Don't take any Cisco exam without knowing that. You got to know that one anyway to even get started with AAA. If you jump into anything like, say, Dot1x port-based authentication, and you're working on the switch, and some commands don't show up, or you keep getting unrecognized command for stuff you know that works, you need to put AAA new model in. You just forgot. Because I guarantee you the next option, which is where we tell everybody where the Radius server is, the IP address, and set a key for it, that will not work unless you have AAA new model written first. So let's go ahead and put in Radius server. And as you can see, we have just a few options, but the only one we're interested in right now is host, where we specify a Radius server. That's right in the middle. And then it's just the host name or the IP address, and we're going to go with another one on our 172.16.23.0/24 network, and we'll put 55. And some more options, and as you can see, Radius gets pretty involved. So we're just getting a small taste of it here. We're going to set the per server encryption key. We'll just set that to CCNP just for fun and giggles. And there you go. Now we need to write an authentication line, an AAA authentication line. Because each one of those A's stands for something, and one of them stands for authentication. So looking at this one, which one do we need? Dot1x, right? We're setting authentication lists for IEEE 802.1x. And we are going to create the default authentication list. We're not going to get into named lists. Let's try default. There we go. And what we want to do here is go with group, because we want the Radius group to be used for this, so the Radius server, so you have to go group and then Radius. And then notice, even though I've defined the authentication we're going to use for the default list, we're going to use Radius for Dot1x, I'm still given the option to use other options. There's line password, local username authentication, case-sensitive local user authentication, and even an option for no authentication. We'll talk in the AAA section about why those are there. We're not going to get into it right now, but I do want to point that out, that you can put more than one authentication source in this line. So we're just going to go with that right now. And then finally, we're actually going to enable Dot1x, and we're going to do that with Dot1x system auth control. Now, and even more finally, we get to go to the interface and do something. Dot1x, and what we want to look at is port control. And there are the options for running Dot1x on this interface. Auto, force unauthorized, and force unauthorized. Okay, well the definition of auto is port state will be set to auto. Okay. Force authorized, port state set to authorized, and force unauthorized, port state will be set to unauthorized. Sounds like a lot of force is being used there. I want to show you this on the board, since we're seeing the command here, and discuss what those things mean. They mean what they sound like. They just sound really odd, because that first force-based option, force authorized, that's exactly what happens. It tells the port to unconditionally authorize the host using no authentication. That's the default, and it may be a default you will want to change. Force unauthorized tells the port to never authorize the host. That seems a little harsh. Auto may be the way to go here, because it allows a host to authorize via an exchange of Dot1x messages, which to me sounds like what we really want to do in the first place. So really that's about it for Dot1x port-based authentication, but one question that naturally arises, and we were talking about this at the very beginning of the video, can you run port security on a Ether channel port group? No, you can't. Can you run it on a port that can trunk? No. Can you run port security and Dot1x authentication on the same port? And you will probably be surprised to find out the answer is yes. And taking this straight from a PDF off Cisco's website, when you enable port security in 802.1x on a port, 1x authenticates the port, and port security manages the number of MAC addresses allowed on that port, including that of the client. So subtle difference in what they're doing there, but yes, you can run them both on the same port. And speaking of ports, we're going to talk about monitoring supports in the very next video with our new best friend Span. I will see you there.